Hi everybody, I'm Mike McCrory and this is Would You Make It? So I started out making a video on how to use the INCRA I-Box jig, and the test cuts that I made turned out to be so successful that I was able to make a box out of those, and I decided to step it up a little bit and create another box with a center keyed splined box joint. A little bit more sophisticated and a little nicer looking. So this is the third video in the series to show you how I finished up the box after creating the carcass, after creating the sides. In this video I'm going to create the bottom, the top, some trays that go inside, and I'll apply a finish as well as a few other things. So let's get started.
I have a piece of padauk that's about 1 inch thick, and I'm going to resaw it down the middle. That will give me a piece for the top and a piece for the bottom. And then I will take those pieces over to the drum sander and sand them down to probably a little bit less than 3/8 of an inch, maybe 5/16 or something like that. Padauk is a fairly oily wood, so it's not the best thing to run through a drum sander because it really sticks to the sandpaper. So you have to clean the sandpaper frequently.
So I'm going to run a rabbet around all the edges of the piece so that it can sit into the top and slip into the bottom. The sides of the box are about 9/16 of an inch, so I've got the blade at 5/8 of an inch, and then I'll just sneak up on the size and test fit it until I get it right.
And now I'm going to draw out a pattern for the handle that I'll make. So I'll use a circle template, and I'm drawing a circle in the center, or an arc, with a 1 inch diameter. And then I'll use another circle that is 1 3/8 inch in diameter. And I chose those because I have matching Forstner bits, so I can use those to drill out those arcs. Now I probably could have cut this whole thing out on the bandsaw, but I think it would be more difficult to get nice, smooth arcs. It would take a lot of sanding. So I think it's a lot easier to use the Forstner bit to get perfectly round arcs, and then I just have to trim it up a little bit on the bandsaw and then sand it. And here I'm drilling the two larger circles that are 1 3/8 inch in diameter. And with the arcs already cut with the Forstner bits, it's a pretty easy process to just trim the remaining pieces. It's very little, in fact, that I need to cut off with the bandsaw. I had already sanded the box joints in the previous episode, but I decided to sand a little bit more aggressively and create more of a rounded edge on the box. So it tapers down toward the bottom and the sides are rounded a little bit. I think it gives it an interesting look. So now it's ready to start assembling. So I'll remove the top and the handle, and then I will glue the bottom in place. And I'll just use a little bit of light clamping pressure to hold everything in place and make sure there's a good bond. And now over the drill press, I've marked the position of the handle on the top, and I'm drilling 2 1/4-inch holes that I can insert dowels through. And then I've put some double-sided tape on the top of the box, and I'm positioning the handle so that it lines up with the holes that I just drilled. I'm just eyeballing it in this case. And then I'll flip it over and drill into the handle so that the holes in the top line up perfectly with the holes in the handle. And then it's just a simple matter of gluing in some dowels and inserting the dowels into the top.
Now it's time to make the trays for the box, and I want to make 2 trays. So I'll take this piece of tiger maple and I will resaw it in half. That will leave me with 2 pieces that are about 3/8 of an inch thick, and then I'll sand it down to about 1/4 of an inch. And then with this remaining maple, I've got 2 other pieces, I'll make all the dividers in the trays.
I have a small piece of wood mounted on the fence just a little bit behind the teeth of the blade, and that helps to avoid the issues that you can find yourself in with blade drift when you're using just the fence by itself. After running the pieces through the drum sander, I will rip them into strips on the table saw so that they are the proper width for the sides of the trays. I'm going to join the sides of the trays together using a regular miter joint. And one of the issues when you're cutting miter joints that you want to be very precisely cut is that it's very difficult to align the piece that you're cutting with the blade. So what I've done is I've cut this piece of wood and I've clamped it to the fence of my miter gauge. And that way I can put pencil marks on the piece that I'm cutting, line it up precisely with the edge that I just cut, and that way I can get very, very precise cuts. It also helps to reduce tear out on the back of the piece when you're cutting it. And then a good way to assemble the sides for the miter joints is to line them all up in a straight line and put tape on one side and then put the glue into the miter joints, and then you can fold it up with the tape holding everything in place. It works really well. I'm also putting a little bit of tape on the bottom of the tray so that when I put the sides around the tray, I can use the tape to hold everything in place. This is so much easier than trying to hold all the pieces in place and struggling to get everything to line up. If you haven't tried this method before, it's really worth trying. Now I'll sand everything, and now that the sides are on the trays, I can get to work on creating the interior compartments. So I'm measuring the width, which is 6 3/8 inches. And then I'm cutting strips again. These are going to be a little bit shallower than the sides because they're sitting on the top of the bottom, whereas the sides go all the way to the bottom side of the bottom. And I'm using a stop block on my miter gauge to be able to cut everything to be the precise length that I need. For these interior compartments, I'm just kind of planning it as I go, and I decided to put 2 pieces that are crossing, and I'm going to use my dado set to cut a slot. It's about 1/4 of an inch in width, and it goes halfway up each of the two pieces that are going to intersect, and then they can crisscross and lock together. After I created these other compartments and laid them out, I realized that I probably didn't want to have the strips of wood to be that high, because it would be difficult to get your fingers into the compartment to place or remove the jewelry. So I've trimmed them down to be about half the height that they were when I first got them. I did that for one of the boxes. For the other box that's going to have larger components, I didn't think it mattered as much, so I left those pieces of wood to be the same height as the sides. And then I'll just clamp everything and let it sit. And with the trays all glued up, I decided to put a spline in the corner of the miter joints. Not really so much for strength, although it will strengthen the joint, but I don't think it needs it in this case because the joint is already fairly strong, especially with all those compartments that are helping to hold everything together. But I'm using this jig to cut slots for 2 splines on each corner. So I'll have a total of 8 per tray, which means I'm cutting 16 slots. And then I'll make the inserts for the splines out of padauk that I have left over. Next, I'll use the flush cut saw to trim the pieces of dowel that are protruding through the top of the box. And then I did the same with the splines to cut them off. And then I sanded the splines down to be flush with the surface. I also used the sander to round over the corners. Next, I'm applying a dewaxed shellac to seal the pores of the wood prior to applying a lacquer. It was a little bit tedious to use a brush to apply the shellac to all of these compartments, but for such a small project, I didn't think it was worth getting out my sprayer for this. Well, that turned out to be a mistake because shellac is alcohol-based, and the alcohol actually released some of the oil in the padauk, and it bled into the maple. So now I have to sand everything down to try to remove the bleed, and this time around I'm going to spray the shellac on, and that turned out to be a lot better.
So it turns out that spraying was a much better option. There's no bleed in the joints, and it's much easier to apply with a sprayer for all these interior compartments. So I wish I'd done that in the first place. So now what I'm going to do is sand everything lightly with 320 grit sandpaper and then apply the lacquer.
I took advantage of the warm weather and sprayed it outside just to have proper ventilation.
Well, I think the box turned out pretty nice despite the bleed problem that I had. So I gotta ask, would you make it?